He lived in poverty after his wife's death and was clearing out an old attic, hoping to find something valuable. But in a dusty box, he saw something that no one could have imagined, and that is what saved his children. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house had grown heavier with each passing week, as though the walls themselves absorbed the grief that lived inside them. For months after Marin's death, silence had settled over the place, like dust, thick, stubborn, and unwilling to be brushed away. It clung to the air, to the corners, to the very breath of the man who walked through the rooms, as if he were a ghost, haunting his own life. Edgar Milton moved slowly from space to space, his hand often brushing the edge of a table or the back of a chair, not for support, but for memory. Each touch reminded him of another life, another time before everything unraveled. The home had once been filled with Marin's warmth, with the rich scent of her cooking, with her laugh that used to rise like sunlight through the windows. But now, with her gone, the house felt abandoned, even when he stood inside it. He had always believed that a house became a home through the people who lived in it, and now he understood the weight of that truth more than ever. Without her, the rooms felt stripped of their soul. Even the kitchen, the room where she had spent her happiest hours, looked foreign to him. Her apron still hung behind the door, a fading floral print stiff with months of disuse. He could not bring himself to touch it. Some things were too sharp to hold. The children moved through the house quietly, as though afraid to disturb something fragile. His son, 12 years old, and suddenly older than he should have been, walked with a seriousness that unsettled Edgar. His daughter, younger by a few years, tried to smile for him now and then, but even her attempts felt like small, trembling lights in a darkened room. They were grieving in their own ways, but Edgar worried that they were also watching him too closely, afraid of what they saw, a man who no longer knew how to carry the weight he had inherited. Bills piled on the kitchen counter, each envelope a reminder of how life continued to demand things he no longer knew how to provide. The electric company had already sent warnings. The medical debts from Marin's treatment grew by the month, and the mortgage he had once managed without effort now felt like an impossible burden. His job as a mechanic barely kept food on the table. Clients in the area were few, and those who did call often paid late or bargained too hard. He tried to hide the worry from his children, but their eyes often drifted to the counter, to the stack of notices with red letters, and their silence told him they understood more than he wanted them to. Nights were the worst. When the children were asleep and the house sank into stillness, Edgar found himself wandering the kitchen, sitting at the table without purpose, staring at a cup of coffee that had long grown cold. The clock ticked too loudly in those hours, each second pressing into him like a reminder that time moved forward even when he didn't. At times, he caught himself listening for sounds that would never return. The soft thud of Marin's footsteps, her humming as she folded laundry, her voice calling to him from down the hall. The realization that those sounds were gone forever often struck him with a fresh wound, as if grief were sharpening itself against him again and again. He wanted to be strong for the children, but some days it felt like he was crumbling from the inside. He lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Marin. She had always been the steady one, the heart of the house. Without her, he felt as though he were trying to navigate a storm without a compass. He whispered apologies into the darkness, apologies for not saving her, for not being enough, for letting the home decay around them. It was irrational, he knew that, but grief had never cared for reason. Mourning brought no relief, only more obligations. The refrigerator was nearly empty, and he counted the remaining dollars in his wallet more times than he admitted. The children tried not to complain when meals were small or repetitive, but he saw the way they looked at the shelves, the way they lingered near the pantry as if hoping food might appear there by will alone. He told them he would figure things out, that they would keep the house because it was their home, because it still carried the warmth of their mother's memory. But each promise felt heavier than the last. It was in one of these moments, standing in the kitchen, holding a bill he could not pay, that his gaze lifted toward the ceiling. The square of the attic hatch sat there quietly, the same as it always had been. He realized then that he had not opened it in years, not since before Maren became ill. She had always said she would take care of it eventually, always brushed aside his offers to sort through the things up there. Now her refusal felt different, as though she had been protecting something, though he couldn't imagine what. He hesitated at first. The idea of rummaging through her belongings felt almost like a violation, as though he were trespassing into a part of her life she hadn't meant to share. But then he thought of his children, of the promises he had made, and the fear that grew heavier every day. He had to try. He had to look. Maybe there was something up there he could sell, old furniture, antiques, anything that might bring in enough money to buy time. Even a few dollars could help keep the lights on a little longer. He pulled a chair beneath the hatch and climbed onto it, his fingers curling around the thin rope that dangled from the wooden door. Dust gathered around the edges, and the wood felt cool beneath his touch. For a moment he closed his eyes, pictured Maren standing beside him, imagined what she might say. But no voice came. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant whir of a car passing outside. With a slow breath, he pulled the rope. The hatch groaned open, sending a shower of dust drifting down to his shoulders. The ladder unfolded with a tired creak, its hinges stiff from years of neglect. The air from above wafted down, stale and thick with the scent of old paper, of fabric long forgotten, of time itself left to settle in the dark. Edgar climbed slowly, each step groaning beneath his weight, until his head rose into the dimness. The attic was darker than he remembered. A single narrow window, clouded with grime, allowed a thin beam of morning light to cut through the gloom. Dust motes floated in the air, dancing like tiny spirits disturbed from their slumber. The space smelled of age, rich with the scent of wood that had dried and cracked over decades. He reached the top and pulled himself inside, standing carefully on the uneven boards. The room was cluttered with boxes stacked at odd angles, some tied with frayed twine, others collapsing under their own weight. Old coats hung from nails hammered into the beams, their shapes slumped like tired silhouettes. A rocking chair leaned against the far wall, one leg broken. There were old suitcases, books yellowed by time, children's toys worn smooth from years of use. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. He felt the weight of memories pressing in on him, not just his own, but those Maren had kept locked away here. He wondered when she had last stood in this space, what she had been thinking, what she had carried in her heart as she placed these items in their resting places. The thought brought an ache to his chest. He began opening boxes, slowly and carefully. The first held old winter clothes scarves, hats, mittens, too worn to be useful but too full of history to throw away easily. The next contained stacks of newspapers, brittle and yellowed, their headlines speaking of events long forgotten. He lifted one and read the date. 1989. He wondered why Maren had kept them, but then again, she had always been sentimental about small things. Another box held children's toys from her early years, wooden blocks, a stuffed rabbit missing an eye, a small wooden car with chipped paint. He paused at these, feeling a pang of closeness and sadness all at once. These had been the things that shaped her childhood, the things she had once loved and held close. He set them aside gently. Time stretched as he worked through the piles. Some items brought soft smiles, others brought heavy sighs. but none of it felt like something that could change their situation. Nothing he could easily sell. Then, in the farthest corner of the attic, where the darkness seemed thickest, he saw it. A wooden trunk, large and heavy, pushed back against the sloping wall as though it had been hidden intentionally. Unlike the other containers, it bore no labels, no signs of wear besides the natural aging of the wood. Its presence stirred something in him. Curiosity, yes, but also unease. He knelt beside it and brushed away a layer of dust, revealing the dull sheen of the old metal latch. It resisted slightly when he tried to lift it, as though the trunk had grown attached to its contents and refused to let go easily. With a firm tug, the latch came free. When he opened the lid, a soft sigh of air escaped, carrying with it the scent of cloth that had not seen the light in decades. Beneath folds of thick, faded fabric lay something strange. He lifted a corner of the cloth and froze. What he saw made no sense at first. A box of wood and wires, with a strip of keys across one edge like the teeth of some forgotten machine. Its surface was smoother than he expected, though worn by time. A small emblem in apple with a bite taken from one side was stamped into the wood, faint but unmistakable. Next to it lay a thin stack of papers. He lifted the top page carefully. The date in the corner read 1976. The diagrams and typed instructions were foreign to him, filled with technical jargon he didn't understand. He stared at the machine again, confusion swirling in his mind. It looked like a relic from another era, a strange hybrid between a typewriter and a radio. He had no idea what it was, but he knew one thing. It didn't belong among the toys and clothes and old dishes. It was different, special in a way he couldn't yet grasp. As he closed the trunk and sat back, the weight of the discovery pressed on him. He didn't know what he had found, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Their situation was desperate. If this strange object could bring even a small amount of money, it was worth trying. He told himself it was just another item, no different from the rest. But deep down, something whispered that he had stumbled upon something far greater than he could imagine. When he climbed back down the ladder, the house felt different. Not lighter, but awake somehow, as though something inside it had shifted. And as he set the wrapped machine on the kitchen table, brushing dust from his hands, he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But possibility. Edgar woke before the sun the next morning, though he wasn't sure he had slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the strange wooden machine lying on the kitchen table, as though it were still up there in the dark attic, waiting for him to find it. The discovery had unsettled him, not in a frightening way, but in a way that made his thoughts restless, constantly circling around the same questions. Why had Maren kept it? What did she know? Why hide it away among things that meant so much to her? He had turned these questions over in his mind for hours, but the silence of the night offered no answers. When dawn finally pressed itself through the curtains, pale and washed out, he rose with the uneasy clarity of a man who understood he could not keep drifting along on his confusion. Something had to be done. He carried the strange device into the garage with the intention of preparing it for the sale he had planned. The garage had always been his refuge, a space where engines made sense, where tools did what they were supposed to, where problems had logical, fixable solutions. But even here, he felt out of place with this relic in his hands. He cleared a spot on the workbench, pushing aside oil-stained rags and scattered tools, then set the machine down gently, as though it were fragile. He removed the cloth that had covered it and studied its form again under better light. Wooden casing, hand-assembled wiring, keys that seemed both familiar and entirely alien. It didn't look broken or damaged, yet its silence felt profound, like it contained a history he wasn't able to read. But whatever it was, he needed the money. Bills weren't going to pay themselves, and the mortgage reminder that arrived last night had been harsher than usual. Selling it, no matter what it turned out to be, wasn't a choice but a necessity. The idea still made him uncomfortable. There was something about the machine that felt personal, not to him, but to Maren. Yet he tried to shake the feeling off. He couldn't afford sentiment anymore. Survival had pushed every other consideration aside. The children were still asleep when he carried tables outside and began setting up for the garage sale. The early morning air was cool, a thin fog settling over the yard, softening the outlines of the worn fence and the cracked driveway. He arranged clothes, books, dishes, and tools with an almost mechanical precision. Each item he placed felt like a small surrender, things they no longer needed, things they could no longer afford to keep. He hated the way it made him feel exposed, as though the neighbors could look over the tables and see not the objects, but the struggle behind them. Eventually, he brought out the wooden machine, wrapped in the same cloth he had found it in. He set it carefully on a separate table, slightly away from the rest, and hesitated before writing the price on a small piece of cardboard. $50. It felt wrong somehow. Too little, too casual. But he reminded himself that he had no idea what it was worth. For all he knew, it was junk. Something old and strange that collectors might find amusing, but not valuable. He placed the sign in front of it and stepped back. People arrived slowly at first, mostly neighbors, who came more out of curiosity than interest. They greeted him with the polite tone normally reserved for funerals, their eyes soft, their mouths pulled into thin lines of sympathy. Some murmured condolences about Maren, as though her death were a topic he needed to revisit every time someone remembered it. Others asked practical questions about the items, but their glances often drifted toward the house, toward the garage, toward the state of things. A few whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. He tried to ignore it. The small purchases trickled in, a set of plates, a stack of books, a few tools. The children eventually joined him, still wearing their pajamas, rubbing their tired eyes. He handed each of them a coin box for the smaller payments, trying to make it feel like a game. But even in their young faces, he could see the same quiet worry he carried. They knew what this sale represented. Something they loved was slipping. For the first hour, no one paid much attention to the wooden machine. People glanced at it, frowned, then moved on. Some chuckled under their breath, calling it a weird typewriter or a homemade radio. A few children poked at the keys before their parents pulled them away. Edgar felt relief each time someone ignored it. Selling it for $50 suddenly felt like giving away something he wasn't supposed to, though he kept pushing down the thought. Then the man appeared. He wasn't from the neighborhood. That was obvious at once. His clothes were too expensive, his posture too confident, his steps too deliberate. He wore a leather jacket that seemed too clean for casual wear, and sunglasses even though the sun had barely risen. He walked through the yard without looking at anything else, without offering a greeting or even glancing at the other tables. His path was direct, purposeful, as though he already knew what he had come for. When he reached the table with the wooden machine, he stopped abruptly. His breath hitched, barely audible, and he leaned forward as though drawn to it. Edgar watched from a short distance, feeling an unexpected tension rise in his chest. The man removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that flicked across the device with a mix of hunger and disbelief. "Where did you get this?" the man asked, his voice low but tight. His tone suggested he had no interest in the rest of the sale, only in this object. Edgar hesitated. "It was in my attic," he replied. "My wife stored it there." The man's jaw clenched. "Your wife? Did she mention where it came from?" "No." Edgar tried to keep his tone neutral. "She never talked about it." The man lifted the machine slightly, turning it in his hands with surprising gentleness. He examined the sides, the bottom, the wiring. The longer he looked, the more unsettled Edgar became. There was recognition in the man's eyes. Recognition, and something sharper. Something closer to excitement. "I'll take it," the man said abruptly. $50 is fine. Edgar felt something cold coil in his stomach. The sudden eagerness, the way the man kept his voice controlled but his hands trembled just slightly. It didn't feel right. Instinct rose up in him like a warning. "Actually," Edgar said slowly, "I'm not sure I want to sell it anymore." The man looked up sharply. "You wrote the price." "I know," Edgar answered, forcing calm into his voice, "but I've changed my mind." A thin line of frustration appeared between the man's eyebrows. He set the machine down with more force than necessary. "Look, I'll give you more if you want. 100. Cash." "I said no," Edgar replied, meeting the man's stare. His voice was steady, though his pulse raced. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them felt tense, almost electric. Then the man exhaled sharply, dropped his sunglasses back into place, and stepped away from the table. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, before turning and walking off, his shoulders tight with irritation, his footsteps heavy. Edgar watched him disappear down the street, a knot tightening in his chest. He looked back at the machine and felt an almost protective instinct rise within him. Whatever this was, it was not something to handle carelessly. He removed the price sign, folded it, and tucked it into his pocket. The machine was no longer for sale. Later that afternoon, long after the tables had been cleared and the children had gone inside, Edgar carried the device into town. He took it to an antique shop he rarely visited, a place filled with old clocks, framed photographs, and furniture that smelled of another century. The owner, Gary Rudding, was a man in his 70s, with keen eyes behind thick glasses. When Edgar set the machine on the counter, Gary stared at it for a long moment, then reached for a pair of white gloves. "Where did you find this?" Gary asked quietly, his voice different from its usual cheerful tone. "In my attic. My wife kept it there." "Do you know what it is?" Gary's expression shifted slowly, from curiosity to astonishment, to something like reverence. "If this is authentic," he whispered, "you're holding a piece of history." He called for specialists. 3 of them arrived within an hour, bringing equipment and notebooks. They inspected the machine from every angle, murmuring technical terms Edgar didn't understand. They checked serial numbers, examined the documents, compared details against reference materials they carried with them. Each minute felt like an eternity. Finally, the lead expert straightened, removed his glasses, and nodded. "It's real," he said. "One of the first. One of the few surviving Apple II computers from 1976. Edgar stared at him, unable to absorb the words. They began speaking about value, about rarity, about collectors who would pay enormous sums for such a device. The numbers they mentioned didn't sound real. 1 million. More than 1 million. Possibly even 2. He felt dizzy, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. Something inside him shifted, a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had nearly sold this for $50. He had almost handed away the only thing that might save his family. The device was taken into secure storage while preparations for an auction began. Forms were signed, photographs were taken, arrangements made. And all the while, Edgar moved through the motions with the feeling that he was walking in someone else's life. Everything was too big, too sudden, too heavy to understand. That night, after the children were asleep, he sat alone in the living room, staring into the quiet darkness. The house felt different again, not merely awake as before, but expectant, as though holding its breath. He thought of Maren, of the years they had spent together, of the small secrets everyone keeps even from those they love most. He tried to imagine her placing the machine in the trunk, choosing to hide it, choosing not to mention it, choosing to protect it. For the first time in months, his grief felt less like a crushing weight and more like a hand resting on his shoulder, steadying him instead of breaking him. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. And though he didn't know what the coming days would bring, he felt, quietly, cautiously, that maybe, just maybe, he was stepping toward something brighter than the darkness he had been living in. He had no idea yet how bright it would become. The week that followed moved with a strange mixture of speed and stillness, as though each day carried the weight of two different realities. In one of them, Edgar continued going through the quiet motions of keeping his household afloat, waking the children for school, preparing meals out of whatever small measure of groceries he could still afford, answering the occasional call for repair work, and combing through the mail with a dread that had not yet fully dissolved. But in the other reality, one that felt distant, unreal, and yet somehow more vibrant than the life he had lived since Marin's passing, the antique shop was preparing to present his discovery to the world. The specialists who had examined the wooden machine had not only confirmed its authenticity, but had placed it among the rarest surviving pieces of early computing history. They spoke of collectors, museums, and private buyers, with a reverence usually reserved for art rather than circuits, treating the device as though it were a fragile, priceless window into the past. For Edgar, the contrast between these two realities was almost unbearable. He found himself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, the same table at which he had cried silently after Marin's death, staring at the place where the wooden machine had once rested, unable to fully grasp what it meant that something so extraordinary had been hidden in their attic for decades. The thin echo of the past still lingered in the corners of the room. When he closed his eyes, he could almost see the faint outline of Marin standing by the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her gentle smile softening the tired mornings that were now so cold without her. He wondered whether she had ever known the value of what she kept, whether she had meant for him to find it one day, or whether she had simply placed it in the trunk with the quiet intuition she often had for preserving things others might have overlooked. The children sensed a change in their father that week, subtle but present, like a shift in the wind before a storm breaks. He wasn't smiling exactly, not yet, but the tension that had gripped his shoulders seemed to loosen. His sighs were less frequent, his silences shorter, and while he still spent long hours lost in thought, there was no longer an empty look in his eyes. They asked him once why he looked different, but he only shrugged, not wanting to promise anything until it became real. He told them he was working on something, and they accepted the answer, perhaps relieved simply to see something soften in him. A date was set for the auction, 1 week away. The event would take place in the city, in one of those grand buildings that Edgar had only ever driven past on his way to small repair jobs. The specialists assured him that the buyer interest was significant, far greater than they had originally anticipated. Rare artifacts had a way of stirring competition among collectors, and with each passing day, the number of inquiries the auction house received grew. The night before the auction, Edgar barely slept. He sat in the living room well past midnight, listening to the soft breathing of his children upstairs, replaying every moment of the last few weeks in his mind. The darkness of the room was punctuated only by the glow of the streetlight that seeped through the curtains, casting faint shadows along the walls. He thought again of the man who had come to the garage sale, the one whose reaction to the apple had been immediate and hungry. The memory made his skin crawl. He was grateful, now more than ever, that he had listened to his instinct. He found himself wondering what Marin might have said if she were here. She had always believed in signs, in the way life sometimes revealed hidden paths in moments of despair. Maybe she would have told him that the discovery was a gift, a final act of grace from a world that had taken too much from them already. Or perhaps she would have laughed softly and said, "See, I told you not everything we store away is useless." The thought made his chest tighten, but this time, it wasn't only from grief. There was a kind of warmth to it, a reminder that some connections didn't break, even when life tried its hardest to sever them. The morning of the auction arrived with a muted light and a sharp chill in the air. Edgar dressed carefully, choosing the best clothes he owned, though they were still modest by any standard. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt, but the tremor felt more like anticipation than fear. He drove the children to a neighbor who had agreed to watch them for the day, and when he kissed them goodbye, his daughter hugged him tightly, her small voice muffled against his jacket as she whispered, "It's going to be okay, Daddy." He held her for a long moment before letting go. The drive into the city felt surreal. Cars passed by him in steady streams. People walked along crowded sidewalks. Life moved as it always had. But Edgar felt separated from it all, as though he were observing the world from behind a thin pane of glass. When he finally reached the auction hall, he sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, gathering the strength to step into a place that seemed far grander than anything he had ever known. The building itself was imposing columns of polished marble rising toward a high stone facade, large windows that caught the morning light and scattered it in soft reflections on the pavement below. People dressed in tailored suits and expensive dresses entered through the wide front doors, laughing or speaking in hushed tones that carried an air of practiced elegance. Edgar felt painfully out of place, but when he reached for the door handle, he told himself that this moment wasn't about fitting in. It was about surviving. It was about giving his children a chance to grow in a world not shaped by debt or fear. Inside, the auction hall was even more intimidating. High ceilings framed by ornate moldings, chandeliers glittering with hundreds of crystals, and rows of velvet-covered seats filled with people who looked entirely at ease in such surroundings. An attendant guided him to a reserved seat near the front, close to the platform where the items would be displayed. He nodded in thanks, though he felt too overwhelmed to speak. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as he sat, his eyes scanning the crowd. Every movement around him felt significant, every whisper magnified in his ears. The apple in the device that had been hidden for decades in the attic was encased in a glass display box on the stage. Lights shone down on it, illuminating the worn wood, the simple keys, the carefully crafted wiring. It looked almost delicate in this setting, almost humble. Yet the people who approached the display lingered in fascination, studying it with expressions of awe and envy. Edgar watched them and felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. This was the machine that had been collecting dust above his head for so many years, unacknowledged, unknown. Now it stood before a room full of people who recognized its value immediately. The auctioneer began the event with a practiced grace, his voice carrying smoothly across the hall. When it was time for the apple eye to be presented, Edgar held his breath. The auctioneer described its history, its rarity, its authenticity, and the room quieted with a palpable intensity. Then the bidding began. The first number called out was so high that Edgar blinked in shock. It didn't seem real. Before he could even process it, another bidder raised the offer, then another and another. The numbers climbed steadily, almost rhythmically, as if the bidders were engaged in a silent duel, each unwilling to yield. Edgar felt the air thicken around him, his pulse quickening with every call. His hands curled unconsciously around the edges of his chair as the bidding soared past 1 million, then 1.5, then approached 2. By the time the auctioneer called out $2.3 million, the room felt suspended in a breathless pause. A final paddle lifted from the back row, and then the gavel came down with a sharp, decisive strike. Sold. The sound seemed to echo, stretching across the hall and settling into Edgar's bones. He sat frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what had happened. $2.3 million. The figure was not just beyond anything he had imagined, it was beyond anything he could have believed possible. He met briefly with the auction representatives afterward, signing documents with a hand that shook more from emotion than nerves. They handed him the check, and for a long moment he simply stared at it, unable to speak. The paper felt impossibly light in his fingers, as though its true weight hadn't yet settled into the world around him. He slipped it carefully into the inner pocket of his jacket, almost afraid to breathe too deeply, as though the slightest movement might cause the fragile miracle to vanish. The drive home was different this time. The world outside the window no longer felt distant. It felt connected to him again, alive in a way he hadn't felt since Marin's illness. He drove with the windows down, letting the cool air brush against his face, grounding him. When he reached the neighbor's house, the children ran out to greet him, their expressions bright with anticipation. He crouched down and wrapped his arms around them both, holding them tightly, as the relief he had been holding back finally spilled over. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, the same place where his grief had often drowned him, and spread out the bills that had haunted him for months. One by one, he marked them as paid, watching the weight of each slip of paper dissolve. The mortgage was cleared, the medical debts settled. The utility bills brought to a balance he hadn't seen in years. By the time he finished, the oppressive heaviness that had clung to his life felt as though it had finally begun to lift. Over the next weeks, the house transformed slowly but steadily. The roof was repaired, the peeling paint replaced with fresh coats that brought life back to the walls. The creaking floorboards tightened, the windows resealed. He planted flowers in the garden, where Marin once tended her favorite herbs, kneeling in the soil she had loved. The children watched the changes with growing excitement, their laughter echoing through the rooms in a way that made Edgar feel as though the house itself was breathing again. He opened savings accounts for each child, setting aside funds for their education, their futures, the opportunities he had feared he would never be able to give them. He replaced their worn shoes, bought new winter coats, stocked the refrigerator with full shelves for the first time in months. But he didn't indulge himself with extravagance. He didn't want or need luxury. What he cherished instead was the sense of stability he had regained, the ability to look toward tomorrow without fear. Some nights, when the children were asleep, he sat in the backyard beneath the fading light of the evening, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. He thought often of Marin, of the way she used to sit on the back steps with a cup of tea, gazing out at the horizon as though she could see something just beyond it. He wondered if she had known how much the discovery in the attic would change their lives, whether she had hidden the machine intentionally or simply placed it among her keepsakes with the calm trust she had always seemed to hold in the world. He found himself speaking to her softly sometimes, thanking her for the gift she had left behind, for the hope that had returned to their children's eyes, for the chance to rebuild the life they had both dreamed of. He no longer felt crushed by grief when he thought of her. Instead, he felt a quiet strength, as though she were still guiding him in ways he couldn't fully understand. One evening, standing in the backyard as the sun slipped behind the horizon, Edgar watched the last amber light fade from the sky and felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. The house behind him glowed with warmth lights in the windows, the sound of the children's footsteps upstairs, the faint murmur of the television. For the first time since Marin's passing, the world felt gentle again. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. They were safe. They were steady. And in the quiet, as the first stars pierced the deepening blue of the sky, he understood something he had missed before. The discovery in the attic had changed their circumstances. Yes, But it was not the money that saved them. It was the reminder that even in the deepest shadows of grief, life could still offer moments of unexpected grace. That hope could grow from places long forgotten. That love could echo across time in ways that defied logic, guiding those left behind. He opened his eyes, looked back at the home he now knew would stand for many years, and felt grateful. Not just for the fortune that had lifted them out of despair, but for the memory of the woman whose quiet strength continued to shape their lives. For the first time in a long while, Edgar smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that rose from somewhere deep within him, and stepped back inside to join his children, ready at last to live again. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next stories. Click to watch the next video. We have more discoveries and unexpected turns waiting for you. Share this video with someone who needs to see it today.